My name's Jeffrey Sidoris, and this is Process Driven, a podcast about creativity. And I am so excited to be able to share this episode with you, this conversation. This is a conversation that I've wanted to have for years. And I can't tell you the first photograph that I ever saw by Gregory Crewdson. I don't remember what it was, but I do remember very clearly how it made me feel, how I connected to this world. Unlike any photographer I can think of off the top of my head, this was instantly familiar to me. This world was familiar to me. The plights, the struggles that these characters seemed to be going through were very much my own. Feelings of disconnect, feelings of isolation, and feelings of hope and possibility that those would pass, that those feelings would pass, that they were stepping stones or bridges to something better. So this work resonated with me and still does on a very deep level. And the opportunity came up to sit down with Gregory and talk about his new body of work, which is called Cathedral of the Pines, much more intimate than the Beneath the Roses body of work, which, as he'll tell you, was epic, not only in scale, but in scope. Where Cathedral of the Pines is a much more intimate production, smaller team, smaller but no less compelling stories and narratives. And it's just a stunning body of work, and I am so grateful to have had the chance to sit down with Gregory to chat about it for a little bit. So enough of me talking. Enjoy this. This is, I've wanted to say this for so long, this is my conversation with Gregory Crewdson.
Please listen carefully.
Well, one of the things that I found interesting about this body of work is after Beneath the Roses, you had talked about wanting to do something more intimate and sort of tighter knit, closed set. Yet there was a decision at some point to use Twitter and Instagram to kind of share a peek into that process. And I wonder, what was the impetus for that? What were you hoping to get from it? And were there any surprises along the way that you got out of it by sharing this process?
Well, firstly, you are absolutely correct that after Beneath the Roses, which was in many respects a kind of epic project.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Not only in terms of the scale, but the period of time,
mm-hmm.
And all the people involved. At the end of that project, I felt it was important to do something much more smaller scale, much more intimate. And the Sanctuary pictures came out of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then after or around the time of making the Sanctuary pictures, my marriage ended. And I had 2 kids, and it was a very kind of dark period,
mm-hmm.
to say the least. And I think it's fair to say that I shut down in almost every way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, aesthetically and also just in terms of my general outlook and well-being. But one thing I did wind up doing was I moved out of New York and moved into a church where I'm speaking to you from now.
Mm-hmm.
And that was almost like an act of survival for me. And I think what I did was I went to a place where I associated with productivity and feeling alive. But quite frankly, it took me about 2 years. It was 2 years once I moved up here of inactivity in terms of making pictures.
before you kind of surfaced.
Right.
Wow.
And it's just sort of, and it wasn't as if other things weren't happening. There were like museum shows and books.
Sure.
So there's a lot of, sort of busy work. And of course, my sort of main objective was trying to find stability and feel reconnected, and I began to, I'm an open water swimmer,
right.
and I sort of religiously began to, walking the Appalachian Trail to a lake called Upper Goose Pond, and would swim, do long swims each day, and then, and that was part of that. I wasn't even quite aware of it, but that was part of a healing process, I think.
Sure.
And then I would also, during the winters, cross country ski through, and this was all in Beckett, in the small town of Beckett. It's barely a town. And I spent a lot of time with Julianne, who's very closely related to this project. And she would accompany me on the walks up and on the trail. And then we would ski together. And it was during one of those skis that I were in the middle of the woods in Beckett in a pine forest, and there was a trail, and there was like a little signpost, and the signpost actually said Cathedral of the Pines.
No kidding.
And
you had no idea previously that this was here?
No. And it was, and there are very few moments in one's life where there's like all at once there's a kind of aesthetic reawakening, but this certainly was one of them, where I saw the whole body of work in my mind's eye. Like I knew the title would be Cathedral of the Pines, and I knew all the pictures would be made in Beckett, that they would be all on location in interiors and landscapes, that we would work with a small crew, that the pictures would be, a return to color, a return to using kind of directorial light. And so, I mean, that's all I needed was the title.
Is it fair to say that this felt more like a calling than the work prior to it?
Yes. Yeah. For me, it was like, and I mean, I know we're speaking in religious terms here. I mean, that's interesting. The title of the book is, the project's called Cathedral of the Pines. I live in a church. There's a kind of sense of revelation, but it's all in aesthetic terms. It's I do think art, at the core, the process of making art is a search for meaning, and so certainly this was that.
Sure. I mean, meaning in your own life, especially after what had come before.
That's right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then it was, it was a process of starting to put the pictures together, and we did 3 productions, and over the course of 2.5 years. And it was just a great sort of period of productivity for me, and a real outburst of after that period of disconnect.
Was it difficult to be sort of non-productive between the shoots because you had all these things sort of fully realized in that moment?
Yeah. Well, once the process started, then things were like moving fast, and like even though there are a lot of time in between productions, at that point there's we were back into printing and into the cycles of pre and production and post production, and so that all felt like very vital and it felt great to sort of finally be back at work.
When you made this kind of realization, or you saw this body of work, is it immediately then or soon after that you go to people like Rick and the rest of the team and say, okay, here's what I've got? Or do you still have to do some sort of internal realization before you're ready to bring that to your production team?
Well, the process of once, we had that, I had that moment in the woods, let's say in sort of winter and we didn't really start shooting till the summer. So there was a whole sort of 4 or 5 months there where I was gathering my thoughts and putting the imagery together, but by the time I met with my sort of core team. Joanne and I had basically written out all the descriptions for that first body of work, and we were ready to go. Now, however, I must say that like in that first production, the first at least week was like very bumpy because
how so?
Well, we were all we were definitely, did not have our sea legs.
You were the new kids at camp.
Yeah. So we were, all of us were I include myself and everyone else, we were all like trying to get back up to speed in terms of all working together. And, unlike Beneath the Roses, which was all shot with 8x10 film, this was all shot digitally. So there was a bunch of speed bumps just trying to get the sensibility right, trying to get the lighting and the feel of the pictures right.
Sure. And, did shooting digitally change in any sort of fundamental way your way of telling stories or your production process, or was it just a matter of making tweaks here and there? Was it more dramatic?
It's a dramatic change. I mean, we shot Sanctuary digitally, but that was a very different body of work. Mm-hmm. And I had the main struggle was trying to find the aesthetic for these pictures, and unlike Beneath the Roses, where we would light full city streets and
sure, close off towns and
have enormous lifts and all right. that. I didn't want that in these pictures. I wanted something much more kind of introverted and quiet, and the references were more painterly than cinematic. So we needed to find a way of making pictures that accommodating that, and we did that. But we had to get to it. We had to all arrive at it together.
Much steeper learning curve. Now, did you develop kind of a shorthand or a vernacular that you were all able to kind of use to stay on the same page aesthetically or narratively?
Yeah, well, the thing, we are best. Our production is best when there's the least amount of discussion happening. When Rick and I particularly are on the same, when we're on point, no discussion necessary. You know,
he knows what you need, you know what he needs, and you just get it done.
Right. But there, you know, in this case, it was a bit of a learning curve for both of us because I didn't know exactly what I wanted, but I sort of knew it when I saw it. And for Rick, it was really an act of restraint, I would say. Like, he had to, you know, he's such a brilliant master of lighting, but he had to, like, his biggest challenge is trying to find that sensibility from doing something much sort of less orchestrated than he has done in the past. And so we got there though, and it wound up being like a very kind of beautiful sense of light in the pictures, and there were certain rules that I made, and I think we all followed like pretty carefully. And that was that for all the interiors, because the bodywork's made up by equal parts interiors and landscapes, that the central lighting source would be coming from outside in. Mm-hmm. So whereas there would be a kind of the main light source would be appear like it came from the sun or some kind of light source like that. But they were really just like very complicated rigs that we set up, or Rick and his team would set up outside. And so he really, particularly in the winter pictures, we really found an aesthetic that was really, I think, perfect for the body of pictures.
Oh, they're gorgeous. They're from the few that I've seen, they are stunning. And in a different way than some of the previous work. Yes. Because they're so much more intimate, both in terms of your production crew and maybe the stories they're trying to tell. Is there a different relationship that you would like the audience to have with the narrative, or is it still okay that they maybe draw their own conclusions about what's going on versus what you have in mind when you shoot them and put them together?
Well, I think it always that's part of, the power of photographs, that in the end, the viewer always brings their own particular history to a picture. And, but for me, it was really important that there was no sort of literal narrative in the pictures, that whatever story is being told is done through atmosphere and light and mood, for sure, mm-hmm. And but there is like very clear themes in the body of work, and I think one of them is the relationship between the figure and nature. And then also there's a sense of longing, I think, in all the pictures, and there's also certainly, there's a lot of flesh in the pictures, and that was very, I think, purposeful. They're very much about bodies and desire, I think, and but also, as in all my pictures, that sort of quiet sense of disconnection.
Do you see the hope in disconnection the way you did in the previous bodies of work? Is that still there?
Yeah, to me, it's like, it's my most hopeful pictures,
Right.
I mean, it's my ambition making these pictures was to make them as, I mean, in some ways, I really see them as celebrations of light, of life, even. And certainly my ambition was trying to make the most beautiful pictures I could.
Right.
Yet there is always that sense of disconnect. And I think that's something that's like, I'm not even 100% conscious of, or really I really don't know where that comes from,
The disconnection.
Yeah. But I would say, like, it's part of being, like, I think it's emblematic of the photographer's fate in a certain way. Like, I think all photographers have a slight remove from the world just by the very, there's something about the medium itself that it separates you from what you're looking at. And you create a frame around the world that also is like a frame that is, making a frame is an act of removal, I think. It's an act of separation. There's always, I think, photographers always will have that underlining sense of voyeurism.
Sure.
In the work that they do.
Well, that was one of the things that kind of resonated with me was you told this story in Brief Encounters about sort of listening in on your father's sessions.
Yes.
And in this body of, well, along with Beneath the Roses, but in this body of work as well, because it's more intimate, it's almost as if we as an audience are sort of cast in the role of you as a child listening in on your work. We're listening in on you the way you listened in on your father, in a sense.
Yeah. I like that. I like that. And that's a nice description. And I do think that, like, the fact that, like, a lot of these pictures were made in domestic settings, and in fact, the whole first production was done in the house that Julianne grew up in.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yes. And that was in Beckett, that's like on location, and we didn't know each other, but like that was miles away from the cabin that I grew up in. So
wow.
There is that.
So this is this intensely personal on so many levels body of work.
Yes, it definitely is. And the thing is, like, that's the framework. That's the framework for making pictures. It's not what the pictures are, like, literally about, I think. And it's like it's not as if the viewer needs to know all that backstory, but from my vantage point as the artist, and it's what made the pictures happen. But there's always in my pictures this very kind of complicated blur between real life and fiction. So it's not as if these pictures are directly autobiographical.
Sure.
They're drawn from certain elements of that and then sort of made into something that's more fictional or blurs the lines between those realms.
Are you able to look at the body of work and see, I might botch this, but see where you started to feel found again? And was there a shift aesthetically post that feeling?
Yeah, well, the first as I said, the first body of the first production, that first summer, was very intense. And it was, as I said, like, there were false starts, and in fact, the first picture we made was probably the first attempt of a picture we made was probably the worst picture I have made in sort of a production in many, many, many years. And I, went home feeling sick to my stomach, and
were you questioning at that point? Was this a good idea?
Yeah. I mean, it was, it's a lot easier not to make pictures than it is to make pictures. So,
right.
So you could carry on and sort of think about how great you are as a photographer, but in the end, when, you're making pictures, it's a struggle. Always. It's hard work. And so the first pictures were all like false starts. And then we just all of a sudden, like something happened, and it all just like came to life. And then from that moment on, I think we were definitely all on the same wavelength. Although I have to admit that, we made like 15 pictures that first production, maybe even 20. We wound up using, about maybe half of them.
Mm-hmm.
But I couldn't even, after that production was over, I couldn't even look at them.
Oh, really? At that first body of work?
Yeah. Just because I was still in some kind of, I don't know, some kind of fractured state. And I couldn't look at them until we made the next pictures. So, which was that following winter. And I have to say, those winter pictures, we were, that was a magical production where just everything seemed to go right. Like, there were struggles, or, we were dealing with like weather, and it was freezing. And I mean, but we were all like, the group of us were like basically working on one compound in Beckett in the middle of winter. And I think everyone was on their game, like in a major, major way. And, and Rick had fully figured out like a beautiful way of lighting the winter exteriors. So we were definitely on course. And then the final production was all basically, it was all on location, and it was all like in forests and by rivers and quarries and stuff. And then by that time, we were working as a great team and able to meet the challenges of working in the woods, and in forests. And so we sort of worked our way to that level.
Mm-hmm. Was there always the intention of having the three different setups as one body of work? Was there ever any consideration of having sort of three separate acts, if you will?
Well, it depends on who you ask. For me, yes. My gallery was surprised. They thought like we had it all wrapped up in the first production. And, I knew that, this is a process, and I knew that there had to be the three productions. So that was part of the struggle too, is like, going into three productions and getting it financed and without showing anyone any pictures, that's also.
You hadn't shown anyone along the way?
No.
Oh, wow.
I mean,
talk about faith, right?
Yes. That was a challenge for everyone. So, but I wasn't willing to show anyone anything until I felt like we had all the pictures we needed to. But, and then there was just like the ongoing post-production effort, which was mammoth in itself. And I was, obsessive about getting exactly the right prints. And
sure. Was post different, shooting digitally versus shooting on film?
Oh yeah, much different. But also, but in the end, it's again, all that stuff are just tools.
Sure.
What you're looking for is something very elusive, and more often than not, we start from scratch like 2 or 3 times, like in post production. Like every one of these prints has gone through the process of building and rebuilding, and then starting again over and over again to try to in some way recreate the thing that we all saw on set.
Is there a difference in I would imagine there is, but I'm not sure. Is there a difference in seeing that moment? Because you're very strong in the way that you talk about the perfection of moments, which I love.
Yes.
And is there a difference in seeing that moment on set versus seeing multiple moments in a gallery setting around you, where everywhere you look, your field of view is sort of filled with these moments?
Well, that's funny that you mentioned that, because I was just speaking to Joanne about that, like just yesterday or the day before. It's like we haven't had that moment yet. Like we've been just looking at each picture and like focusing on it.
Wow.
And we haven't seen all the pictures framed in one space yet. And I think that's going to be certainly something,
Absolutely.
Overwhelmed, yeah. I think, but even on an individual basis, you have to sort of get over the trying to, in the end, no matter the photograph, the image is something different from what you saw, and necessarily.
Sure.
And so what you're recreating is not exactly something you saw, but something you think you saw or something. I don't know. Like it's something different from what you saw,
right?
You witnessed, but.
There's a terrific John Hurt quote that he gives in an interview where he's talking about basically saying, I'd rather have memory than a photograph, because however inaccurate my memory, I'd prefer that memory than one which is prompted by the tedious reality of a photograph. And I love that.
I like that. Yes, that's so, I can relate to that.
Yeah, it was fantastic. And it seems like there's almost this need in your work to perfectly capture this sort of moment of being lost in order to present the possibility of being found.
Yes. Right. Yes.
Which I find endlessly fascinating, because on a personal level, I often feel so absolutely apart from the world that I'm in.
Yes.
That these photographs click with me on such a deep level. So I do spend a great deal of time thinking about your work. Oddly enough.
That's nice. You just like, as an artist, particularly when you're, since this body of work, I mean, part of the thing was like to make the pictures in sort of, in separate, from the world and in privacy in a certain way. I mean, that was part of the reasoning of making pictures in remote locations and all of that. And so as the pictures are just starting to kind of trickle out, it's really lovely to hear the comments and things. It's really.
Was that, back to kind of the first question, was that a conscious decision on your part to release these sort of behind the scenes things? Was that an insistence on the gallery's part? Who decided to let people in to this world?
Well, here's the thing. So we, in this period, in the period we're in, where everyone is documented in every part of their life, and,
right.
and everyone's on their cell phones. We did have a discussion with everyone on the crew early on, and we said, like, we want you to document this whole process of making the pictures, Um, However, we would like just, then control the flow of information. So
So it was designed to be curated from the beginning.
in general terms, we didn't know exactly what we were going to do with the pictures, but we knew. Now, this even started earlier when I was like, when I would do these hikes and stuff and swims, and also just drive back and forth from New York. I would just like make pictures of myself and, send them to Julianne, and she would do the same. And so we already had a kind of archive of pictures to start with.
As a viewer, as a member of your audience, I got to tell you, it was weird.
Yes.
It was like, the Wonka factory firing up again. You just, the wheels start spinning, and I spoke to some friends about it, and I was like, hey, have you seen Crewdson's back? And they're like, what? Wait, on Instagram? Why is he on Instagram? There was this whole sort of discussion that would take place of what's going on? What could this be? Right. And I found it endlessly fascinating, these sort of cryptic pictures that would come out with sometimes a caption, sometimes not. And it was such an interest piquer for someone who is a fan of the work and is a fan of the process of the work.
Right. Well, here's So, so we started documenting the process, but we didn't. We kept them sort of together and just in our studio for a long period. So. It's slightly deceptive in terms of the flow of information. It's like because I didn't want those pictures to come out in real time, because I thought it would just be too disruptive of the entire process. So like many of the pictures that you saw that were like sent out on Instagram had happened previously.
Sure.
And
we didn't know that.
Right.
And that was sort of the great deception of it was you're sort of in this sort of post-production sanctuary, and we're still thinking that you're out there freezing your butt off on location, and there's a whole sort of disconnect, which I think even strengthens the work even more because we're disconnected from the process.
Right.
But we think we're connected.
That's so true. And there's something to the fact that pictures are evidence, and we're so used, and they're documents, and Instagram is used in that particular way. And so we had this huge archive of information, of pictures, that documented the entire thing from like before production to after. And then it was really Julianne who thought like we should start sending these out in social media. I had never even been on Instagram before, so I was not a great practitioner.
Right.
But I thought like this would be absolutely perfect because it tells everything and nothing at the same time. Like,
yes, it's frustrating, Gregory.
And so it reveals everything but nothing at the same time. Like, the pictures remain sort of it's the only thing that remains unseen.
Right.
And I also think there was something interesting to the fact that like I had never like put pictures of myself out there in the world of like, in these sort of intimate situations of hiking. And so I do think that in the end, all these pictures sort of the idea is to create a third meaning of some sort, and we started with the emblem of, Cathedral of the Pines has the pine.
Right. Whose idea was the tattoo?
Well, so the emblem originally came out of it was the grip flag. So that's like like on the first week of production, the grips created that emblem completely separate from me, or I had no knowledge of it. And I came on set one day and it sort of flies there like a parrot, like a pirate flag,
Oh, that's great.
But I immediately loved it. I was like, wow, we got to do something with that. And
right.
then like members of the crew started getting like tattoos.
That's so great.
And I was like, this is becoming interesting. And then I decided to use it as the cover of the emblem as the cover of the book. And
on some level, it had to be the cover of the book, didn't it?
yeah, it had to be.
I mean, it's so representative of not only the body of work, but the sort of tightness of the crew that created it.
Exactly. It's like creating a family.
Mm-hmm.
It's very powerful, I think.
I would imagine and hope that helped bring you out as well. That helped.
Yes. And also my children were on set, and they were on set with Joanne's kids. And so there was like a lot of bonding, and, and Lily, my daughter, is in one picture, and Joanne's kids are in a few of them. And so all of that was part of a kind of a rebirthing process, I think.
That's terrific. Do you see this as emerging as kind of a default way that you'd like to work moving forward with this type of close production and this type of production process?
Well, yeah. I mean, I feel like we're like on our, like, as I said earlier, like we're definitely on our game, and like right now we're just like, it's been a process of like trying to do all work together to get the show out there. But like, I will definitely say that there will not be a long period of time between my next body work and this, like that I definitely will not let that happen again.
Could you see yourself releasing? I mean, I find it fascinating how you release bodies of work rather than individual or small batches of images. Could you see yourself ever moving in that direction, or is there more? Power's the wrong word, but is there more impact or connection to the work, releasing it all as one body of work in totality?
I mean, that's the way I always thought about it. Like, I think of it more maybe in terms of like a movie, you know, like a movie, there's this whole process of like, that takes years from beginning to end. And then you open and it's one larger statement, and it's a fully realized body of work. And that's the way I do it. You know, I can't imagine making pictures otherwise, although we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Do you see a difference in reaction audiences? I've thought about this primarily with Beneath the Roses. Do audiences in places like Pittsfield or Beckett to the current body of work, do they react differently than audiences, say, in Manhattan or Boston, because the work is so much more personal to their landscape, to their life, to their way of life?
Well, I'm not quite sure about that. I mean, I think that like one of the reasons I work in one place over and over again is because you can go deep rather than wide, I think is the best way to put it. And certainly when you become a known quantity, it's easier to do things, you know, like it's easier to close down streets. And so you become like a kind of, like it's like the town in administrations, and
you're almost a fixture at that point.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, so, I mean, in this body work, we had to rely less on those things, but like it still was helpful in many ways. And I'm not quite, again, I'm like, after I make the pictures, I feel like my job's over, and I'm not quite sure like what and people think of it here or anywhere.
Is there still, I mean, I asked you on Instagram when you were first looking at the book, is there a nervousness in opening that book for the first time, even though you've lived with the creation of these images? And yes. You said yes. Are you ever able to look at these images, whatever body of work it is, and say, that's exactly what I wanted to say the way I wanted to say it? Or is there always something gnawing and going, well, I wish I would have done this, or next time I'd like to do this?
There's brief periods of time where like it all looks exactly right, but that's like that's momentary, you know.
and then you're back to second guessing.
And then you're like, yeah. And then you know, and then you have to let go of the work and then make the next thing. You know, that's just the job of the artist. I don't know many filmmakers or writers or musicians who like spend time like looking at their own stuff. You know, it's just not the way it goes.
Is it difficult for you, sort of post-creation, to look back on work?
Yeah. Oh, yes. It's painful. It's a painful.
Really painful.
Painful. Yes.
That's a charged word.
Yes. Painful.
Wow. Do you see these worlds as created? Are we seeing different facets of the same sort of universe, insofar as that they're all sort of being created by you, but are the stories that you're telling within Cathedral of the Pines, is this a unified world? Are these all people all part of the same compound? Are they part of the same group? Absolutely.
Like, that's so important that the pieces all feel like it comes from one place, like one world, that it's fully realized, you know, and that's part of the struggle. Like, you know, what I hope when a viewer looks at my pictures is that they're really not aware of everything it took to make the pictures, and that they're just kind of propelled into a world, you know, that that's what I want in the end. You know, that's the hardest part, really. That's like, it's the hardest part when like all the busy work is done and like you've arranged all the pixels in the right sort of formation, and you don't think about anything but the picture.
There's no need to be aware of it as long as there's some sort of deeper visceral reaction.
That's right. I mean, that's why like I go through so much effort. There's a paradox where like I go through so much effort to like remove any evidence of a photographic image. In other words, like anything that like presents itself as part of being a picture, like grain or blur or movement or distortion of the image.
Any sort of artifact.
Yeah.
And has that been a constant throughout your career, do you think? Or is it more important later on now?
I think that's always been the case, but like more so in these pictures, like, because I don't want like people to be thinking about like where the operatics of the lighting or the production.
Yeah. How's he lighting this? It's almost like watching if you're watching a film that's got great special effects and you think to yourself, those are some great special effects. Well, then they probably aren't great special effects because they've taken you out of the narrative to think about the special effects.
Right. Exactly. And that's the thing with time is like, you know, that because the hope is you're always making these things better and resolving the issues. And so when you look at previous pictures now, that's one of the reasons you only see the flaws, because your standards get higher, I guess.
Sure. You know, with every body of work.
Yes, I think so.
So do you have any idea whether you continue this particular narrative, or now do you move on to a new story, or have you even given yourself a chance to think about that in those terms?
Well, I think that's all like, these are all good questions. And like, I think that like only time will tell in terms of what the next manifestation is, you know. Hopefully we'll know soon.
You had mentioned in I think it was in Brief Encounters, or it might have been one of the interviews, that Beneath the Roses for a time was thought of as a film. Have you given any more thought to the moving image, or are stills exactly where you need to be?
Well, there's always discussions about making a movie. I mean, that's just like there's, you know, and I have to say it's serious discussions of making a movie, and that's ebbs and flows. But like, I think that that if we find exactly the right story and it's the right circumstances with the right people involved, that very well could happen.
It's got to be a struggle though, because you've been so strong about your concern with just this moment, not before, not after.
I'm very happy doing what I'm doing now, and I will always identify myself as a photographer first and foremost, and I do naturalistically think in single images. So that's where the challenge would be.
What a pleasure that was to talk to Gregory about this new body of work. Absolutely beautiful pictures. I mean, they are stunning. So thank you very much, Gregory, for taking the time to sit down and talk about the work. And also, I'd like to thank Julianne for helping to make this happen. I appreciate your time so much. If you'd like to see Cathedral of the Pines, the show opens at the Gagosian Gallery in New York City on January 28th and runs through March 5th. Also, Aperture will be publishing Cathedral of the Pines as a book in mid-March, I believe, 15th, 17th, somewhere around there. But you can pre-order it on Amazon or, I'm assuming, wherever books are sold. If you'd like to follow Gregory on Instagram or Twitter, you can do so at Crewdson Studio. That's all one word, Crewdson Studio. If you enjoyed the conversation, and I hope you did, please consider subscribing on iTunes or in your favorite podcast app. I've got some terrific guests lined up, and I'm sure the conversations are going to be fantastic, so I hope you will come along for that. You can follow me on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook at Jeffrey Saddoris. That's JEFFERY SADDORIS. And thank you so much for listening to this. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I hope you'll come back for the next one.